inquietante muerte de una estrella. Todo el mundo quiere saber qué ocurrió y cada minuto cuenta.
Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock.
Ahora, por primera vez, vamos detrás de la escena del crimen. Con simulaciones digitales forenses y dramatizaciones, seguimos la investigación, mientras la policía corre contra el reloj para resolver el caso. En este episodio, el legendario Beatle John Lennon, asesinado en la puerta de su edificio.
The defendant then proceeded to go into what's called a combat stance and proceeded to fire.
People couldn't believe that this happened.
If he's not dead, John Lennon can't be dead.
Veremos la carrera por salvar la vida de Lennon.
I literally held his heart in my hand, squeezing it as we attempted to restore circulation.
Nos adentramos en la mente de un asesino trastornado.
Chapman felt that he was saving the world by killing John Lennon.
Y conoceremos nuevos detalles sobre el plan de exterminio del asesino.
He had a hit list. He acknowledged that there were others.
A continuación, en famosas escenas de crimen, John Lennon. Otoño de 1980. La leyenda del rock John Lennon vive en Nueva York con su esposa Yoko Ono y su hijo de 5 años, Sean.
He had sort of disappeared into be a father and a husband. And he was just getting back into things again. It was just this album that was just coming out. He was just beginning to do interviews. He was just beginning to find his voice again.
Alentados por el éxito de Double Fantasy, John y Yoko empiezan a componer su continuación, Walking on Thin Ice.
Earlier in the evening on December 8th, John Lennon and his wife Yoko left the Dakota to go to the record plant. They came back that evening around 10:50 or so.
And they're walking from the curb through that vestibule, and the doorman was behind both of them.
Mientras John Lennon atraviesa la entrada del edificio,
Mr. Lennon.
El conserje oye 5 disparos. Luego ve que Lennon camina pesadamente y se desploma en el despacho del conserje. Un segundo empleado llama rápidamente al 911.
Someone's been shot at the Dakota. Ambulance, quick.
I was assigned as a police officer to the 20th precinct, and we get a call over the radio, shots fired at 1 West 72nd Street, which we know is the Dakota. When we pulled up, there was a man standing out on the street yelling, "That's the man doing the shooting." And I saw a man standing there with his hands up.
Turn around, put your hand up against the wall, please.
I proceeded to put handcuffs on him.
En ese momento, los agentes Jim Moran y Bill Gamble llegan a la escena.
2 of my fellow police officers had gone into the vestibule in the Dakota and picked up a man and carried him out, and he was bleeding from the mouth. It was John Lennon. It kind of shook me up because if you know anything about gunshot wounds, if it's coming out of your mouth, it's surely in your lungs, and that's not a good sign.
Anytime the uniformed force put somebody in a car and take them to the hospital, they're in bad shape because they didn't have time to wait for the ambulance.
Mientras la patrulla se dirige velozmente al hospital, Spiro revisa la cartera del sospechoso y encuentra una licencia de conducir de Hawái que lo identifica como Mark David Chapman.
I yelled to some of the guys to set up a crime scene right away. I looked down on the ground and there were clothes on the ground. So I said to this guy, I said, "These your clothes?" And he says, yes, that's my clothes. And the book is mine too.
Además de la ropa y el libro de Salinger, el guardián entre el centeno, la policía obtiene una evidencia más importante.
The doorman who was on duty that night confronted the defendant after he had fired the shots. He kicked the gun away and another employee secured it at the Dakota until it was given over to the police.
There was a revolver. I believe it was a .38. There's no shells ejected. They remain in the gun. We had witnesses. We had the gun. We had the perpetrator.
Poco antes de las 11 p.m., Spiro lleva al sospechoso a la delegación. Al mismo tiempo, la patrulla que traslada a Lennon llega al Hospital Roosevelt. Demoró 5 minutos en recorrer 15 calles.
He was actually carried into the emergency department by 2 police officers. We had no idea who he was. We knew there was someone gunshot. There was no blood pressure, no pulse, no signs of life. He was literally dead on arrival. In spite of that, we knew that there was a small chance, if the injuries were correct, that we could resuscitate him with surgical procedures and with blood.
Los médicos realizan una traqueotomía de emergencia a través de una incisión del lado izquierdo del pecho para separar las costillas, abrir la cavidad torácica y llegar al corazón.
It was filled with blood. There was no wound to the heart. But there were 3 gunshot wounds that entered the left upper chest. They had completely destroyed all of the vessels leaving the heart.
What you really want to do immediately in a condition like that is put in an airway and establish circulation. So that means that you have to get the heart pumping.
I literally held his heart in my hand, squeezing it as we attempted to restore circulation.
Luego de 20 minutos de constantes esfuerzos de reanimación, John Lennon continúa sin reaccionar y es declarado muerto a las 11:20 p.m. del 8 de diciembre.
There was a silence in the trauma room. Many of the nurses and some of the doctors were very emotional and some crying. I walked down to the other end of the emergency department where Yoko Ono had been waiting, and patients' families almost always know, simply by the demeanor of the doctor walking in the room, what the result was. But in this case, Yoko Ono literally for about 5 minutes said, "You're lying, it's not true, it can't be true, he's not dead, I don't believe you."
Con todos sus años de experiencia, el Dr. Lin enfrenta otras cuestiones alejadas de la rutina.
What would we do with the dirty linens? We wanted to make certain that all the linens are appropriately destroyed, that nobody took one of those soiled sheets home as a souvenir. We had to make certain that none of the staff ran out of the emergency department and told a story. We did that mostly to make certain that it was told in a way that would guarantee the privacy of Yoko Ono and her family.
At approximately 11 o'clock this evening, John Lennon arrived at the emergency room at the Roosevelt Hospital. In spite of the effort of many physicians and after many procedures, we were unable to restore the life of Mr. Lennon.
Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock.
Cuando el mundo descubre la trágica muerte de John Lennon, los fans acuden a la calle 72 frente al Dakota a llorar la pérdida de su ídolo.
When I got there were hundreds of people there. It was maybe an hour after it happened. People were so upset, in shock. People couldn't believe that this happened. The idea of him being murdered, it's just nothing that you would ever think of.
He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
En la delegación número 20 de la policía, Spiro procesa al único sospechoso y abre una investigación oficial por homicidio contra Mark David Chapman, de 25 años, nacido en Georgia.
We went into the detention cell, strip searched him. He had a wallet, some identification, key to a hotel room, and I think $2,200 in cash.
Chapman es llevado a una sala de interrogatorio donde voluntariamente da información a la policía.
He wasn't my typical homicide guy. He was very polite and cooperative.
He's talking about what drove him to do what he did. Talked about the little voice in him and the big voice in him, one saying do it and the other one saying not do it. And he basically couldn't fight his so-called inner voices when he did it. So he gave us a whole confession, not handwritten by him, but signed by him.
En apariencia es un caso cerrado. Un testigo identificó a Chapman como el agresor y el acusado confesó. Pero como bien sabe la policía, los casos de homicidio no suelen ser tan simples.
Once you read the statement that the defendant had given, he was talking about there was a big part of me that didn't want to do this and a small part of me that was the devil. It was clear that he was talking in a way that was consistent with him seeking to lodge an insanity defense.
A continuación, en famosas escenas de crimen, John Lennon. En las horas posteriores al asesinato del legendario Beatle John Lennon, la multitud mantiene una vigilia frente al Dakota. La policía inicia su investigación entrevistando a los testigos del hecho.
I saw John and Yoko get out of the limousine, and then I heard 4 or 5 shots. They were shattered. And I heard a woman screaming. It was Yoko. She was screaming, "Help me!"
Con estos relatos y la confesión de Mark David Chapman empiezan a reconstruir los hechos que culminaron en el asesinato de Lennon.
There was no question. There were a variety of witnesses who testified that the defendant had indeed been out in front of the Dakota for a number of days.
And one of the very ironic twists of this horrible story, Chapman actually met Lennon on Monday afternoon and asked Lennon for an autograph.
5 hours before Chapman shot him, Lennon came out, was given autographs, he signed the album, he was really excited, Chapman, and then Lennon was gone. He was so blown over by Lennon's niceness, so he didn't do it.
Esa noche, cuando los cazadores de autógrafos se retiraron, Chapman esperó frente al Dakota a que Lennon regresara.
The witnesses verified that the defendant called out to him, and the defendant then proceeded to go into what's called a combat stance and proceeded to fire.
Lennon recibió 3 impactos. 2 balas entraron del lado izquierdo de la espalda, atravesaron el pecho y salieron. Otras 2 impactaron en su hombro derecho. Una atravesó el brazo izquierdo. La otra se alojó en el cuello. La 5ª bala no impactó en él y se incrustó en la pared.
All 5 bullets fired in the direction of John Lennon. He knew very well what he was doing.
La mañana siguiente al atentado, Chapman espera para comparecer ante un tribunal de Nueva York. Como predijo el fiscal Hogreff, el abogado de oficio de Chapman declara que su cliente es inocente por razones de demencia.
The penal law in New York says you're entitled to the insanity defense if you have a mental disease, and that mental disease prevents you from knowing what you're doing or that it was wrong.
Chapman es internado en el Hospital Psiquiátrico Bellevue para 30 días de observación. La defensa contrata a varios médicos para examinar a Chapman y contribuir a probar su supuesta demencia.
Not the easiest hurdle in the world, not by a long shot. Less than 1% of all criminal cases are ever ruled psychiatrically in favor of the defendant. It just doesn't happen.
Y las autoridades de Nueva York buscan pistas que confirmen la salud de las facultades mentales de Chapman, empezando por la llave de la habitación de hotel.
The defendant came to New York on around December 5th of 1980, checked in first to the YMCA. He didn't like the accommodations there and moved to the Sheraton. When he left the Sheraton on the morning of December 8th, he left behind certain photographs and personal items.
These things were representing what he felt to be the good things in his life, his childhood, the work he had done with children at a YMCA camp, the photograph of the Cowardly Lion, an image of a car he'd had, showing that he was an ordinary, normal, basically decent person.
This was entirely consistent with someone who was narcissistic, someone who was saying by that display, look at me. Look at aspects of my childhood. Look how important and significant I am. It was designed, in my view, to bring attention to himself.
A 24 horas del asesinato de Lennon, el forense de Nueva York da su informe.
Mr. Lennon died as a result of multiple gunshot wounds of the chest and left shoulder. He was struck by 4 bullets.
La autopsia revela la destrucción de los vasos sanguíneos del corazón, provocando una hemorragia masiva, sumada a una bala que perforó el pulmón de Lennon.
The medical examiner found all of the bullets that were involved. The bullets were, in fact, hollow points.
Mientras una bala común hiere el cuerpo al ingresar a gran velocidad, la bala de punta hueca se aplasta, llega al doble de su tamaño y daña un área más amplia.
He had been a security guard. He knew about guns. He didn't leave a lot of things to chance. This was the way an assassin plans to the detail to make a hit.
Luego de pasar 30 días en Bellevue, trasladan a Chapman a la prisión municipal de Rikers Island, donde continúa su evaluación psiquiátrica.
Mark's underlying issue was his hatred for his father. His father was abusive and hit Mark's mother. He had this internally stored anger that he could not express. He couldn't get it out. He couldn't do anything with it.
There was clearly a struggle going on within him between love and violence. In Chapman's mind, these were always extreme opposites. On the one hand, Chapman adored the Beatles, and then like that, it turned into intense hatred against Lennon.
La defensa empieza a ver a Chapman como un esquizofrénico paranoico con una peligrosa vida de fantasía ajena a la realidad.
He was not the most articulate patient I've ever seen. When I asked him what he was thinking, the best Chapman could say was to liken himself literally to the Catcher in the Rye. He carried the book as if to say, "Here, you want to know about me? Read the book. You'll find me."
Mark began to actually think that he was the real-life Holden Caulfield, and only he saw the truth about all the phoniness and hypocrisy in the world.
Chapman ve a Lennon como un gran hipócrita, un músico millonario que habla de no tener posesiones.
In Mark's mind, it was up to him to make a statement, to do something about it.
Chapman did not view what he did as a crime. He, in effect, felt that he was saving the world by killing John Lennon.
En diciembre de 1980, Mark David Chapman, acusado del homicidio de John Lennon, se declara inocente por demencia. Para la policía de Nueva York, Chapman distingue el bien del mal. Es un asesino egocéntrico y narcisista con un motivo claro.
The defendant was asked whether he had considered murdering anyone else. Why was it that he was focused on John Lennon? It's clear from the responses that he gave, the defendant had in fact considered killing other famous people, consistent with his motive, to kill a famous person, to bring attention to himself.
He had a hit list: Johnny Carson, John Lennon, Marlon Brando, Walter Cronkite, and Jackie Onassis. He acknowledged that there were others.
Los investigadores descubren que Chapman viajó a Nueva York en noviembre para tratar de asesinar a alguien, pero no a John Lennon.
George C. Scott was starring in a one-man show, Patton. The defendant claimed that he had gotten a ticket, sat in the first row of the theater, and was prepared to stand up in the middle of the show, raise his gun, and fire bullets into the body of George C. Scott.
Pero el plan de Chapman se frustró cuando quiso comprar municiones en una armería.
Legally, if you don't have a gun license in New York, you can't get any kind of ammunition.
So it wasn't the big part of him convincing the small part not to commit a murder. It was a gun with no bullets.
Días después de este primer intento fallido, Chapman regresó a su pueblo natal, un suburbio de Atlanta, Georgia, a comprar municiones.
He had to travel to get the bullets for the gun that he purchased in Hawaii. So that was calculating. That was premeditated. He knew what was right and wrong.
Pero la más clara evidencia del estado mental de Chapman son sus actos posteriores al homicidio.
Later on, it dawned on me that this guy wanted to be caught. He was only 500 feet from a subway.
Chapman tenía muchas escapatorias, no una, sino dos entradas al metro. Cruzando la calle está el Central Park, lleno de áreas arboladas para esconderse.
He could have dropped the gun, walked away, and disappeared. He decided not to.
His motive was to bring attention to himself. He knew very well what he was doing.
I fail to see how his remaining proves that he was sane in one iota. It's my professional opinion that the killer who fails to make any attempt to conceal his act or to flee from it has, when you come right down to it, no appreciation that he's doing something wrong.
En agosto de 1981 juzgan a Mark David Chapman por el asesinato de John Lennon. Pero a último momento, Chapman anuncia que Dios le ha pedido que se declare culpable.
The man who murdered John Lennon stood in a courtroom in New York City today and pleaded guilty.
I felt cheated a little bit because we didn't get our moment in time to tell the whole story.
I believe that at a criminal trial, this motive of being focused on John Lennon, of being crazy, of acting out against phony individuals, would have been totally unmasked.
Chapman cumple el mínimo de 20 años de cadena perpetua en la prisión de Ática. Es un prisionero modelo, pero le niegan la libertad condicional en 5 oportunidades.
He did want to become associated with someone who was great, if in the worst way possible, by murdering them.
He wanted to be famous by being infamous.
That is the crime. The crime is that Mark David Chapman's name certainly became well known when it shouldn't have.
A 30 años de la muerte de Lennon, sus fans siguen visitando Strawberry Fields, un monumento a pasos de donde asesinaron al ex Beatle.
On this day of celebration,
I remember when Strawberry Fields was dedicated, there were tens of thousands of people who came.
as a growing monument to John's spirit.
So many of the things that John did, he did for the betterment of the planet. He was someone that truly wanted to do good.
The people who love him see him in glowing terms that you only see saints. Since he died, John Lennon has become a saint.